was past midnight when I boarded the last bus out of town. The rain drizzled against the windows, and the cold air seeped through the small cracks near the door. The driver, an old man with hollow eyes and a distant look, barely acknowledged me as I climbed aboard. There were only a handful of passengers, scattered throughout the dimly lit interior. The air inside was heavy with the scent of damp fabric and something else, something I couldn't quite place. I sat near the middle, close enough to see the driver's reflection in the large rearview mirror, but far enough from the few other passengers. The bus pulled away from the station, its engine groaning as we entered the empty highway, the streetlights fading into the distance. At first, everything seemed normal. The road stretched ahead, winding through dense forest, the trees swaying eerily in the wind. The only sounds were the occasional cough from an old man a few rows ahead and the rhythmic hum of the tires against the wet pavement. But as we drove deeper into the night, I began to notice something off. The first thing that struck me was the silence. The usual sounds of the road, passing cars, distant sirens, even the chirping of nocturnal insects, were absent. It was as if we had entered a vacuum where only the bus existed. I checked my phone, no signal. That wasn't too unusual in rural areas, but something about the darkness outside felt wrong, as if it stretched endlessly, swallowing everything. Then I noticed the passengers. When I had boarded, there had been at least 6 or 7 people. But now only 3 remained. I was sure of it. A young woman had been sitting near the front, reading a book, and a man in a gray hoodie had been dozing near the back. Both were gone. I scanned the floor, the seats, no bags, no signs they had ever been there. My stomach tightened. I turned to the driver. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice barely carrying over the low hum of the engine. "Did we make any stops?" The old man didn't answer. He didn't even blink. His gaze remained fixed on the road, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "Hey," I tried again, louder this time. "Did you see where the other passengers went?" This time, he turned slightly, just enough for me to see his face in the mirror. His eyes were darker than before, sunken, almost hollow. His lips barely moved as he whispered, "They left." Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. I turned to the remaining passengers. An elderly man sat a few rows ahead, his head down, muttering something under his breath. A woman in a long black coat sat at the very back, her face obscured by shadows. Neither of them seemed to notice me, nor did they react to the empty seats around them. I swallowed hard and checked my phone again. Still no signal. The bus was going faster now, the trees outside blurring into a wall of black. I glanced at the clock above the driver's seat. 3:12 a.m. That wasn't right. I had boarded the bus at midnight. The ride was supposed to take an hour, maybe a little more. But somehow 3 hours had passed. Panic started to rise in my chest. I needed to get off this bus. I stood up and walked toward the driver. "I want to get off. Now." The old man didn't answer. I said, "I want to get off." My voice was shaking now. The driver turned his head slightly, just enough for me to see his profile. His skin was pale, almost gray. His lips curled into a twisted smile, revealing teeth that looked wrong. Too sharp. Too many. I stumbled back. The bus lurched violently, and I grabbed a seat to steady myself. The road outside had changed, no longer a highway, but a narrow, winding path through endless darkness. The headlights barely illuminated the way, and in the distance I saw shapes. Figures standing by the roadside, their faces blurred, their eyes following the bus as it passed. The murmuring from the old man in front grew louder. I turned to look at him, and my blood ran cold. His mouth moved rapidly, whispering words that made no sense. His hands gripped the seat in front of him, his knuckles white. And then, without warning, he stopped. Slowly, he turned his head toward me. His eyes were gone. Just empty sockets staring into nothingness. His lips parted, and in a voice that was not his, he whispered, "You're next." A scream caught in my throat as the lights inside the bus flickered and died. The engine roared, the vehicle shaking violently. I turned toward the back, where the woman in the black coat had been sitting, only to find her standing directly behind me. Her face was shrouded in shadow, but her hand reached out, long fingers curling toward my arm. The moment she touched me, a wave of cold shot through my body, and my vision blurred. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the driver's face in the mirror, smiling, his eyes nothing but hollow pits. Then silence. I woke up on the side of the road. The sun was rising, casting a pale glow over the wet pavement. There was no sign of the bus, no tire tracks, no footprints. Just me alone, in the middle of nowhere. My phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. You made it. I never found out what happened that night. I never saw that bus again. But sometimes when I drive down lonely roads at night, I swear I hear it. The low hum of an engine in the distance, getting closer. And I know it's looking for its next passenger. I stared at my phone's screen, my hands trembling. The message, you made it, glowed against the dim morning light, but there was no number, no contact name. Just those 3 words. A cold wind rustled through the trees beside the road, sending a shiver down my spine. The highway stretched ahead, empty, silent. There were no signs of the bus, no tire marks, no indication that it had ever been there. I was completely alone. I checked the time. 6:45 a.m. I had no memory of how I got off the bus. The last thing I remembered was the driver's grin, the woman's icy touch, and the overwhelming darkness swallowing me whole. And yet, here I was, standing on the side of the road with nothing but the clothes on my back and my phone. I needed to find help. I started walking, my legs weak and unsteady, as if I had been asleep for days. The road stretched on endlessly, flanked by tall, gnarled trees that seemed to lean toward me. My mind raced, replaying the events of the night over and over. The disappearing passengers, the unnatural silence, the things I had seen outside the bus, and that voice, "You're next." I shook my head, trying to push the memory away. I needed to focus. After what felt like an eternity, I saw a gas station in the distance. Relief washed over me. Civilization. Someone who could tell me where I was, maybe even call for help. The place was old, the sign flickering weakly, barely holding on. A single car was parked near the entrance, a rusted pickup truck with faded paint. The windows were dark, no movement inside. I stepped into the gas station, the bell above the door jingling softly. The air was thick with the smell of old coffee and gasoline. Behind the counter stood an old man, his face worn and lined with deep wrinkles. His milky eyes locked onto mine the moment I entered, as if he had been expecting me. "You all right, son?" His voice was rough, like he had been smoking for decades. I don't know," I admitted. "I need help. I was on a bus, and then..." "A bus?" The old man's expression changed instantly. His lips tightened, and he straightened slightly, as if my words had unsettled him. A woman had appeared from the back of the store. She was in her 50s, wearing a faded flannel shirt, her hands dusted with flour like she had been baking. But it was her expression that sent a chill through me. She looked horrified. "You saw it," she whispered. I swallowed hard. "Saw what?" She turned to the old man. "Jack, he was on it." The man, Jack, stared at me for a long moment, then exhaled sharply. "Damn." He rubbed his face. "How many?" I hesitated. "I don't know. There were a few others, but they disappeared." Jack nodded grimly. "Figures." My pulse quickened. "What's going on? What was that bus?" The woman leaned against the counter, eyes dark with something between fear and pity. "That bus hasn't been real for years." I felt my stomach drop. "What do you mean?" Jack sighed, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "The midnight bus," he muttered. "Last route out of town. It crashed about 30 years ago. Ran right off the road, down into the gorge. Killed everyone on board." The woman nodded. "They never found the bodies. Only the wreckage. People say the driver took a wrong turn, but..." She shook her head. "Some folks believe he was trying to take them somewhere else." I gripped the counter. "That's not possible. I was on that bus. I saw the driver. I saw the passengers." Jack's eyes met mine, steady and serious. "And yet, here you are." The weight of his words sank in. I had been on a bus that didn't exist. A bus that crashed decades ago. And somehow I had made it out. Or at least most of me had. A chill ran through me. I checked my phone again. The message, "You made it," was still there, but something had changed. The timestamp was gone. I stared at it, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. My reflection in the dark screen of my phone looked off. Wrong. Too pale. Too blurry around the edges. Like I wasn't really there. Jack watched me carefully. "Son, you need to listen to me. If you got off that bus, you ain't out of the woods yet. It doesn't like losing passengers." The woman nodded. "If it let you go, it's only because it plans to come back for you." The bell above the gas station door jingled. The 3 of us froze. The air grew heavy. The faint smell of damp fabric and something rotten filled the store. A low hum vibrated through the walls. It was the sound of an engine. Outside, headlights flickered in the distance, growing closer. The bus was back, and this time, it wasn't leaving without me. The midnight bus, final stop. The hum of the engine grew louder, vibrating through the floor beneath my feet. Jack and the woman exchanged a glance, one filled with unspoken understanding, as if they had seen this before. I turned toward the window. Through the dirty glass, I saw it. The bus. It was parked just beyond the gas station's flickering lights, its engine rumbling like a distant storm. The headlights cut through the early morning mist, casting long, unnatural shadows that stretched toward the store like reaching fingers. The doors hissed open. I couldn't breathe. Something moved inside. Shapes shifting in the dimly lit interior, figures seated in rigid silence. And then the driver. He sat motionless behind the wheel, his sunken eyes locked onto me, his lips curling into that impossible grin. Jack grabbed my arm. "You can't go back. Do you hear me?" His grip was strong, but his voice was urgent, almost desperate. The woman was already moving, reaching for something behind the counter. A rusted key, a small, worn-out object I couldn't quite see. "You have to leave," she said quickly. "Now." I felt something tugging at me, not physically, but inside. A pull like an unseen force reaching into my chest, dragging me toward the door. The air in the store grew heavy. The lights flickered. The world outside the bus was beginning to blur, as if reality itself was unraveling. The figures inside the bus turned their heads. All of them, at the same time, their hollow eyes locked onto me. Jack pulled me toward the back door. "Go out the back. Don't look back. Don't stop. And whatever you do," his voice shook, "don't answer if it calls your name." My heart was pounding. The hum of the bus grew deeper, more insistent. My body felt weightless, unsteady, like I was somewhere in between. The doors of the gas station burst open. The wind howled through the store, carrying the scent of wet asphalt and something old, something that should have stayed buried. And then I heard it. A voice. Familiar. Close. Whispering from the doorway. It was me. My own voice calling softly. "Come on. The bus is waiting." Jack shoved me hard toward the back door. The woman threw the rusted key at my feet. The last thing I saw before I bolted was the driver, standing inside the gas station now, his face inches from mine. His mouth stretched impossibly wide, revealing endless rows of jagged teeth. Then the lights went out. I ran. I don't remember how long or how far. The road twisted and stretched into eternity, the gas station disappearing behind me like it had never been there. The world felt thin, fragile, as if I had somehow stepped outside of it. And then silence. The air was still. The bus was gone. I was alone. I checked my phone. The message was still there. But now there was another. One I hadn't seen before. "Final stop soon." The screen flickered, and in the dark reflection just behind me, a pair of hollow eyes stared back.